Chapter 13. Barney Feeds the Hogs. Oh ho, why don't you blow? Ah, come roll him over. Oh ho, why don't you blow? Ah, come roll him over. Halyard Shanty. Captain Hagestrom, leaning over the rail at the break of the poop, was shouting through cupped hands at the chief mate. Bert saw rather than heard the words. "Where ship?" "Aye, sir," answered the mate. "Where ship?" "Wind's hauled to southwest, blowing half a gale." Bert turned quickly as a voice spoke close to his ear. It was Nick Previson. "When we get on the other tack, we can make some northing," Nick explained. "I see that," Bert shouted back. "But since we're sailing by the wind, why don't we tack ship instead of wearing?" "Lose all our canvas," Nick answered. "When you wear, you keep all your squaresails full, but when you tack, they all come edge to wind, aback, and edge to wind again before they fill on the other tack. Old canvas like this stuff won't stand it." Bert's lips were already framing the words. But why did they send ships to sea without proper gear? When he checked himself, flushing, he did not want to hear the answer to that question. "Clew up that mainsail," the chief mate bellowed. "Douse the spanker and put a reef in her while she's down." Nick Previson, who seemed suddenly to have taken a personal interest in Bert, hauled with him on the clew lines, bunt lines, and leech lines until the great mainsail was bundled up to its yard. "Square mizzen and main yard. Man the braces." Did he mean lee braces or weather braces? Bert's unspoken question was answered by 12 or 15 men moving aft and lining up along the weather bulwarks, with the big ropes of the 6 mizzen braces laid along the deck beside them. Slowly the bark rose to an even keel, and its motion became easier as its turning brought the wind over the stern. The force of the wind, too, seemed to lessen at once. A thwart ship, standing in the port scuppers, which were empty of water for the first time in 2 hours, the mate quickly threw all the braces from their pins. With a whirring of blocks that was audible even above the roar of the wind, the great steel yards squared themselves while the men hauled in the slackened weather braces as fast as their hands could move. At a signal from the mate, the man nearest the pins belayed the braces, and the men moved forward. Meanwhile, another group of men, under the second mate, finished squaring the main yards. The two groups merged and together squared the 4 yards and braced them around for the port tack. Then they moved aft again to bend their backs to the main and mizzen braces and swing the yards hard around. One after the other, the staysails and jibs slackened, spilled their wind, and filled again with a bang on the new tack. It was scarcely noticeable that where the dirty gray of the outer jib had been, there was now only the dirty gray of the sky, while a few shreds whipped from the stay. As the wind came forward of the beam again, it seemed to blow with even greater fury than before. The mainsail and crossjack were made fast instead of being set again. Idle for the moment and feeling suddenly weak and tired, Bert leaned against the cabin bulkhead. From directly over his head, on the projecting edge of the poop, came the voice of the skipper shouting into the chief mate's ears. "There aren't 3 sound sails on the bark. My God, man, it's murder to send a ship to sea in this condition. See that seam split in the mizzen lower topsail? Make it fast before it goes." A boom like a cannon shot punctuated his command. "There goes the main lower topsail," he added. To the boy's startled eyes, it seemed as though an actual explosion had taken place. One instant, the sail was there, whole. The next instant, not a square foot of it was left standing. Fragments of canvas from the size of a tablecloth to the size of a lady's handkerchief went soaring off to leeward to drop on the sea a quarter-mile away. Men were already hauling on the clew lines, leech lines, and bunt lines of the mizzen lower topsail. Bert went forward to lend a hand. "Lay aloft and furl it," the third mate shouted, and Bert joined the cursing men who swung into the rigging. When the boy was halfway up and before a single man had reached the yard, the weather clew line parted. The corner of the sail lashed wildly for a moment before the nearest bunt line, and then the next gave way under the strain. The sail bellied up with a sharp crack. There was the sound of ripping canvas like the scream of a buzz saw, and the sky showed through the sail. The climbing men stopped and looked to the deck. With a gesture of profound disgust, Charlie Hanson motioned them down. In 10 minutes, the weather half of the sail was split neatly into long streamers, which soon lashed themselves to pieces. Then, seam by seam, the lee half followed. The bark was so short of canvas now that it was necessary to reset some of the furled sails. Accordingly, the main lower top-gallant sail and the fore lower top-gallant sail and the upper topsail were loosed and laboriously set. Swinging from the shrouds to the deck when the work aloft was done, Bert bumped against Barney, the hog man, who was heading aft with an empty pail in each hand. One glistening eye regarded Bert, while the other looked dully out upon the raging waters. "Man, this is some blow," he said enthusiastically. "Best storm I ever did see." "Where are you going with those?" Bert shouted, pointing to the buckets. "These here?" Barney answered. "Why, these here is for hog feed. Storm or shine, I gotta feed my hogs, sir. Feeding them hogs is my job, sir, just like your job is taking care of them sails. And God helping me, I'm going to do my job till they sew me up in canvas and drop me over the stern. Did you ever see me clog, sir? Tra-la-la, lee-la-la-la-la-la." Despite the buckets and the careening deck, Barney managed several steps of his dance before he brought up with a clatter against the bulwarks. Bert laughed, with a little catch in his throat, and advised the hog man to keep one hand free to hang on. Under Barney's care, the hogs were faring well. The men had not eaten since breakfast, and it was now mid-afternoon. Bert decided to try for a handout from the galley. As the young seaman made his way across the deck, he realized that the bark's motion was different. There was more roll now, since with shortened sail she would not lie so close to the wind. In the galley, he found Joe Bloom, stoking his fire and caroling cheerfully. "We were rolling round the Cape, 'twas a marvelous escape, for the wind blew off the captain's wooden leg." His own wooden leg tapped on the iron deck as he walked from the coal bin to the stove and back again for another shovelful. Stepping into the mess, Bert hastily made himself a sardine sandwich and was returning to the galley for coffee when a cry and the intermittent rattle of a heavy object striking against steel and wood summoned him to the deck. Stuffing as much as possible of the sandwich into his mouth and the rest into a pocket inside his oilskins, he bolted from the galley. From the top of the deckhouse came the sound of a sharp blow and splintering wood. He looked up to see a hole in the side of a lifeboat where a flying block had struck it. The block on the corner of the lashing main topmast staysail carried sudden death in its compact little body. The staysail sheets had parted. At the foot of the mainmast, a man struggled to free the staysail halyard, while another tugged at the downhaul. In the instant that the halyard was off its pin, the block shot upward as in one last destructive effort, and flicked through the upper lee corner of the great foresail as though it had been made of cobweb. Then the triangle of canvas slid down the stay, and Bert joined the men who fought it into submission on the deck. The staysail was saved. The sheets could be repaired easily, but the staysail was of comparatively little importance. And the foresail, Bert learned from the men's conversation, was one of the few sails on the bark whose canvas was fit to stand a blow. Now it was only a matter of time until it would travel to limbo with its fellows. Einar Nelson came running forward, shouting something unintelligible and pointing aloft. As he reached them, they caught the words, "Hole in lower topgallant, clew it up!" But before the sheets were slacked off and the clew lines tightened, before Bert and the others were halfway up the fore-rigging, the familiar, sickening rip told them that they were too late. Still they climbed. It might be saved with only a vertical rip. As Bert climbed past the foretop, he heard, to leeward of him, the unmistakable sound of a heavy chain passing through a block at great speed. An instant later came the sound of ripping canvas, and then the machine-gun rattle of chain striking a yard. Instinctively, shrinking closer to the shrouds, Bert glanced quickly upward to see 12 feet of chain writhing through the air from the madly lashing clew of the upper topsail. 4 pounds to the foot that chain weighed, so a seaman who worked in the shipyards as a rigger during the winter had told Bert. And the whipping, crackling sail twirled it in every possible direction, as though it were a piece of string. With awestruck eyes, Bert watched the chain in its work of destruction. There was a gaping hole through the upper topsail where it snapped the chain back on itself. Again, the chain struck a terrific blow on the great steel tube that was the lower topsail yard. Now it struck across the yard and below it, cutting a long slice across the seams of the lower topsail and widening the wound as it drew back for another blow. Gradually, the radius of the chain's swings decreased as the men on deck hauled frantically on the clew line, drawing the clew of the sail up to the yard. At last, the chain hung idle, writhing feebly like a dying serpent. But the damage was done. The upper topsail was burst open from its self-inflicted wound, and the lower topsail opened out strip by strip until the entire lee half of the sail was but shreds, whipping from the bolt ropes. Bert looked aft. The barque's vast topworks were nearly as bare of sail as when she had lain alongside the pier in San Francisco harbor. With the loss of each sail, the barque lay a little farther off the wind and a little more in the trough of the seas that looked mammoth, even when seen from above. Bert realized that with each roll of the vessel, it was more difficult to keep his hold on the shrouds. The masts were like inverted pendulums, or, Bert shuddered at the thought, like the hurling arms of colossal catapults. If a man relaxed his grip at the wrong instant, he would be sent spinning through the air into the frothing gray waters. The boy gripped the shrouds for the reassurance of their solid strength, then looked quickly at his hands. Yes, his hands were on the shrouds, but they felt nothing, numb with cold. Slowly he climbed down, watching his hands to be sure that they did not let go without his knowledge. On deck, the faces of the men told him what he dared not ask. The Queen of Asia might not weather the storm. The parted sheets of the main topmast sail had been repaired and the sail set again, but 2 other staysails and the jib and inner jib were gone. The big foresail ripped from the hole in the upper lee corner where the block had punched it to the bolt rope at its foot, and while it was being clewed up to save the canvas, it ripped again and again. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, there was nothing left standing but the close reefed spanker, the main topmast staysail, and by some strange quirk, the weather half of the 4 lower topsail. The vessel lay squarely in the trough of the seas and rolled horribly, rolled to leeward until great walls of water poured over the bulwarks, staggered slowly upright, the water waist deep on her main deck, and rolled to windward until the water on her decks boiled over the bulwarks to meet the foaming seas that strove to climb aboard. Where the long main deck had been was now a great waterfall that reversed its direction every few seconds. The men clung to the tops of the deckhouses or sought shelter inside them. There was nothing to do but wait. Drenched, cold, and hungry, Bert huddled in the midst of a group on top of the midship deckhouse, bracing himself against a lifeboat. As never before, he was thankful for the nearness of Nick Previson and Fred von Bergen. "If there is not a miracle, she will roll her sticks out, be dismasted," the German shouted. Bert nodded. Already he saw the Queen of Asia as a mastless, drifting hulk. But another vision was even more vivid in his mind's eye. He saw an office far away. In the office, a tired man with graying temples bending over a desk, his head in his hands, waiting for a wireless report that might never come. And close beside that vision was still another, of a home, where a woman waited, and her 2 daughters. Suddenly, as though raging nature were peeping out to laugh at her work of destruction, the sun burst through the cold grayness of the western sky and shone as brightly as on a clear midsummer's day. For a moment, the men seemed to take heart at the sight. Then one of them laughed sardonically and shouted something which the wind carried away before it reached Bert's ears. A young seaman near Bert was shivering violently. Was it cold or fear that made him tremble so? If only they could have hot food, but the galley was long since flooded and the fires drowned. As the sun sank from the sight behind the heaving seas which obliterated the horizon, the tearing force of the wind seemed to lessen. Raising himself upright to test the wind's strength, Bert caught sight of the captain on the poop beckoning them aft. They went, fighting every foot of the way, now clinging to stays or stanchions while the water swirled about their legs, now making a short dash over the plank-covered piles only to cling for their lives to anything handy while another sea swept across the deck. In one place the water had lifted the planks from the piles and shot them overboard. As he carefully circled the place, Bert saw the piles working with each roll of the vessel. The chief mate stood watching them grimly. "We've got to get sail on her in this lull," the mate cried. "The deck load is going adrift." Get sail on her. Easier said than done, but it was done. Done by Nick Prepison in his shirt sleeves, Fred Von Bergen, and 10 other men, picked by the mate, while Bert, to his chagrin, obeyed the mate's order to assist the second in searching for usable sails among the old ones that had been hauled from the sail locker up to the poop. Old Smith was there too, and Pete Condon, who had not been present when the mate picked the men for the dangerous work of bending on a new main lower topsail. When Bert glanced up as he bent over a sail and saw the pockmarked seaman facing him a scant 3 feet away, he thanked God for football and tackled low. It was an impulsive act, almost an instinctive one. The boy tackled uphill as the bark took a vicious roll to port. The force of the tackle, behind which Bert put every ounce of his 145 pounds, aided by the roll of the vessel, sent the pockmarked man hurtling forward. There was a heavy thump as his head struck the steel wall of the chart house, and he lay still. Surprised and suddenly afraid, Bert scrambled to his feet. What if he had killed the man? "Good." It was the voice of Old Smith close to his ear. "I saw why you fell from the yard. Pete kicked you off." Old Smith bent over the prone man and heaved him ungently onto the space between the chart house and the sails. "Ought to throw him overboard," the old man growled. Bert looked around. The second's back was turned. The captain rounded the corner of the house. His face was haggard and drawn. "Never mind the sails," he said. "They're all rotten. It's not worth risking men's lives to bend them on." Catching sight of the unconscious man, he asked, "Who's that?" "Pete Condon," answered Old Smith before Bert could speak. "He bumped his head on the chart house." Captain Hagestrom turned away indifferently to wait for the chief mate, who was striding aft on the poop. "That new lower topsail won't last 5 minutes, Captain," said the mate. "And the deck load is going adrift," he added with a wry grin. "And beat this if you can, Captain. Barney is still feeding the hogs." Then the night closed down over the raging sea and the wallowing, helpless vessel. The wind, after its brief lull, returned with greater ferocity to whimper and shriek and roar through the rigging until the whole vessel quivered from its force. Now the seas loomed suddenly out of the darkness above the bark's deck, as though each were a super monster bent on engulfing this toy of man's. Overhead, at first by one and then by hundreds, the stars popped out of a clear sky. Nature was fairly outdoing herself to make her little joke a success.